often custom design them to best suit their own needs. Push sticks are not a good project for the table saw. Because you have to hold them in your hands, push sticks usually have curved shapes, and they have a notch or groove that's placed against the stock. These curves and notches are more easily cut on a bandsaw, scroll saw, or even a saber saw. Plywood is a good material, although a close-grained wood is okay for the simpler push sticks. Take the time to smooth all edges and corners. Feather boards are another indispensable tool for cutting on the table saw. Feather boards are made from a solid piece of stock that has a series of kerfs cut at one end and equidistant from each other and in line with the grain. This produces a spring-like action when they're clamped against stock on the table. Feather boards are used to hold stock against the fence for ripping or to hold stock against the table. They help to get more accurate cuts, but more importantly, they help to eliminate kickbacks. The feather board is a good first project for the table saw. A shooting board or table is a tool for improving the accuracy of various cross-cutting operations. A shooting board is used instead of a miter gauge for holding stock as it's guided across the table. Each shooting board is built for a specific angle of cut. A 90-degree shooting board is the most common, but it can be handy to have ones for other angles since they're not adjustable. The base of the shooting board is made from a thin piece of plywood or some other sheet material. Mounted to the bottom of this board are two runners carefully placed to line up with the miter slots in the tabletop. A vertical stop board is mounted across the back edge. The stock is held firmly against this stop board while the shooting board is pushed over the saw. A shooting board is an intermediate level project to build, but not beyond most novice woodworkers. Just remember, if it's not precisely accurate, every cut you make with it will also be off. There are many more tools and accessories that come in handy when operating a table saw. A dead man or support device is very useful for supporting long pieces of stock as they come off the table. Extra throat plates are custom mats to specific blades. Miter gauges with extra strips of wood attached can give greater control over stock material during cross-cutting operations. A safe and well-organized wood shop has all its tools and accessories stored in a convenient location so that there's no excuse for not using them. All of the general safety rules for working in a wood shop hold true for operating the table saw. Wear the proper clothing and protective gear. The table saw can throw dust and scrap material up in your face, so the use of protective eye gear is especially important. Work in a well-lit area and support the work properly. Proper support is especially important on the outfeed side of the saw. Always make sure the power is disconnected or the on-off safety key is removed before changing blades or making adjustments to the saw. Power cords and extension cables should be carefully selected to match the amperage rating of the saw. Undersized electrical cords can rob the saw of its power and shorten the life of the motor. Keep the floor around the saw swept clean and free of oil or other hazards. You'll need good traction to push stock through the saw. Do not try to carry on a conversation while you're setting up or operating the table saw. Do not let yourself get distracted. If your friends refuse to respect your need for concentration, ask them to leave the area. It's your safety and health that are at risk. Here are a few additional safety rules to keep in mind when you're using a table saw. Keep the guard and splitter in place. The blade on a table saw is partially exposed, so the first rule is to always keep the guard in place whenever it's possible. The splitter and anti-kickback pawls will help to prevent binding and kickbacks, so use all guards. Use the proper blade for each job. Select the proper blade for the work to be done, and in most cases, a combination blade will be adequate for all cross-cutting operations. Use rip blades when you're ripping with the grain of the wood. The blade should be sharp, true, and clean for best results. Only use blades with proper set teeth to prevent binding or kickbacks. It's very dangerous to use a dull or insufficiently set blade. Check the blade to ensure it revolves freely and make sure the arbor nut is properly tightened. Adjust the height and angle before each operation. Adjust the saw height and angle properly depending on the project. Don't assume the last person left the saw set up for your needs. For most operations, the blade should project above the stock no more than 1/8 inch. This will help to prevent kickback and injuries from the blade. Secure all clamps and locks. Be sure all clamps and locking devices are tightly set and properly positioned before you begin cutting operations. Do not try to make any adjustments to your setup while the saw is running. Use the fence and miter gauge properly. Never try to cut without the fence, the miter gauge, or a jig to guide the stock. Use the miter gauge or a shooter board for cross-cut operations. Use the fence for ripping stock. Never use the fence and miter gauge at the same time for cross-cutting because this can cause a kickback. Use a clearance block mounted at the front of the fence to step off stock during repetitive cross-cutting operations. Never cut stock freehand. Inspect your stock. Inspect your stock carefully before cutting it on the table saw. All stock should have a straight and true edge, and the stock should lie flat on the table. You should not use the table saw to cut stock that has rough or uneven faces. Wood that's warped, cupped, or twisted can cause kickbacks. Do not cut small pieces that force you to put your hands inside the safety margin of 4 inches. The table saw is not the right tool for these cuts. Position yourself properly. It's very important to position yourself properly when using the table saw. In most cases, you should stand to the right of the path of the blade. Now, if there is a kickback, the stock will generally travel in line with the blade. So do not let any other person stand in line with the saw blade either. Wear the proper clothing. Roll up your sleeves or wear a tight-fitting shop coat. Never wear loose jewelry, long hair that is not pinned back, neckties, or anything that might get caught in the saw. Eye protection and hearing protection are required. Maintain a 4-inch safety margin. Maintain at least a 4-inch margin of safety around the saw blade. Keep your fingers at least 4 inches away from the saw at all times. This margin should give you the ability to react to emergency situations before you lose any fingers. Use push sticks or other devices so that you cannot make contact with the blade. Make sure the blade is clear before starting the saw. Make sure the blade is clear before you start up the saw. All tools and wood should be removed from the tabletop. Vibration can cause them to move and become safety hazards. Once the table is clear, start the saw and let it come up to full speed before you begin to cut. Anticipate and prevent kickbacks. Table saws have a tendency to throw the stock back at you when the blade binds or jams. This is called kickback. Kickbacks usually occur when the stock gets pinched or jammed between the saw blade and the guide. Dull blades or improperly fed stock, cutting wood with knots or paint, these are all possible causes for kickbacks. Always keep your body away from the rotating blade. Do not reach over the saw blade to remove stock. Have a helper or tail person assist in handling large or long pieces of stock. Use pusher sticks and feather boards to control the stock. This will allow you to keep your hands away from the blade and still control the stock properly. When the cut has been made, push the stock well clear of the blade and then turn the power off. Never release control of the stock while it's in contact with the blade. This, too, can cause kickbacks. Allow the blade to come to a complete stop before removing scrap or making any additional saw adjustments. Never leave the saw while it's running. Never leave the machine before the blade has come to a complete stop. Maintain a clean work area. Keep the table clean and free of excess dust or scrap. But always wait until after the blade has stopped moving to remove waste and sawdust. Lower the blade when you're done. After you've finished the cutting operation and have cleaned up the debris, lower the blade so it will not get damaged. One final note about safety: think carefully about the job. Stop if you have any doubts and ask for help. Most injuries occur after the operator has ignored a premonition or bad feeling about the operation. In this section of the program, we'll demonstrate a few of the more common operating procedures for cutting with a table saw. We'll cover rip cuts, cross cuts, including miter cuts and bevel cuts, and finally, we will cover simple dado cuts. When you rip on the table saw, the fence is used to guide the material through the saw. Start by checking to see that the power is turned off to the saw. Select and mount the proper blade. Use the blade elevation wheel to raise the blade to 1/8 inch above the top of the stock to be ripped. Lock the elevation wheel in place and check the tilt position of the blade and lock it as well. Move the fence to the desired position. Measure from the fence to the blade using a tooth which is set towards the fence. When it's in place, tighten the fence lever. Double check the distance between the fence to the saw blade. You may want to check to see that the fence is parallel to the blade by measuring to the miter slots. Now, if the table saw is properly adjusted by the shop supervisor, the blade will be parallel to the miter slots. Use the guard system. Use a feather board to help keep the stock positioned properly and to prevent kickbacks. Inspect your stock to be sure it has a straight edge and flat surface against the table. Prepare yourself with the proper safety gear and tools. Place the stock on the table but away from the blade and stand to the right of the blade. Have your assistant prepared to receive the stock on the other side of the table. Secure approval of your supervisor or instructor before continuing. Start the saw and wait for it to come up to full speed. Make sure the stock is held firmly against the fence. Now remember to maintain a 4-inch safety zone. If the width you're ripping is less than 5 inches, you should use a push stick. Begin to slowly feed the stock into the blade. Push the stock clear of the far side of the blade. The assistant should only prevent the stock from falling. He should never pull on the stock or help to guide it. This can cause binding and risk of serious injury. It's the operator's responsibility to tell the assistant what he is to do. If you ever feel the blade bind up or begin to jam, hold the stock firmly and immediately turn the saw off. Wait for the saw to come to a complete stop. Do not attempt to pull the stock back or off the blade. This will surely cause a kickback. When the cut is done, turn off the motor and stay with the saw until it stops. Check your work and clean up the area. Lower the saw blade and put your tools away. To make a cross cut on the table saw, you'll have to move the fence out of the way. Never use the fence as a stop while making a cross cut. All cross cuts require the use of a miter gauge or shooting board to control the stock during the cut. Never cut freehand on the table saw, even if the cut doesn't have to be accurate. After you have mounted the proper cross-cut blade, get the guard into position.